Hey everybody, Peter Maravelis here, and on behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and our partners here at Gray Area, I would like to welcome you to day 3 and the finale of the Logic Books Festival. Over the course of the last 3 days, we've been exploring the ways we interact with technology and how it affects our lives. We've been also celebrating an important new collaboration between Logic Magazine and the publisher FSG Originals. It's the publication of 4 new books, each of them focusing on important and very timely issues. Logic Magazine was founded over 3 years ago with the aim of exploring technology and its effects on culture and deepening the discourse around technology. Let me disconnect this. Sorry about that, folks. Old tech. So Logic is all about focusing on technology, thinking about technology, how it affects our lives. Each issue focuses on a theme and then rigorously explores it. It thinks about all the who, whats, and whys of how technology is developed, who finances it, who benefits from it, and why, and then explores the possibilities for building more equitable and sustainable technology. Over the course of the last 3 Knowledge Gray Area, our co-presenter and producer of tonight's event. Gray Area is the cultural center and educational hub located in San Francisco's Mission District. Their mission is to apply art and technology to create social and civic impact through education, incubation, and public events. They use digital tools to create art and design projects that benefit society. So to learn more about their calendar of events and workshops, please do visit grayarea.org. It's been a really great pleasure working with them in the past, and City Lights is honored and thrilled to be working with them again on this really fantastic project. So this is the final session. We aim to revisit some of the ideas of the last couple of days and also explore the possibilities of reimagining our relationship to technology. With us tonight are Adrian Daub, Tim Hwang, Xiaowei Wang, Ben Tarnoff, and Moira Weigel. The panel will be moderated by Rob and Sloan. So now a word about our participants. Adrian Daub is a professor of comparative literature and German studies at Stanford University and the director of the Michelle R. Clayman Institute for Gender Studies. His research focuses on the intersection of literature, music, and philosophy in the 19th century. And he's the author of several books published by academic presses. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, The New Republic, N+1, as well as the Los Angeles Review of Books and other outlets. He makes his home in San Francisco. Tim Hwang is a writer and researcher. He's the former director of the Harvard-MIT Ethics and Governance of AI Initiative, and previously served as the global policy lead for artificial intelligence and machine learning at Google. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wired, The Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, amongst other publications. He makes his home in New York City. Xiaowei Wang is a technologist, a filmmaker, an artist, and a writer. The creative director at Logic. Their work encompasses community-based and public arts projects, data visualization, technology, ecology, and education. Their projects have been finalists for the Index Design Awards and featured by the New York Times, the BBC, Vice, as well as many other media outlets. They're working towards a PhD at UC Berkeley, where they're part of the National Science Foundation's Environment and Society Data Science for the 21st Century Research Traineeship. Also with us is Ben Tarnoff. He's the author of the books A Counterfeiter's Paradise and The Bohemians, and is a co-founder of Logic Magazine. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, The New Republic, Jacobin, Lapham's Quarterly, amongst other publications. He makes his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Also with us is Moira Weigel, the author of Labor of Love, The Invention of Dating. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Nation, as well as many other places. She is a co-founder of Logic as well. She received a fellowship from the Harvard Society of Fellows in 2016 and also lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So our moderator for tonight is none other than Robin Sloan, no stranger to City Lights. We've had some really fun times staging events. He's the author of the novels Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore and the book Sourdough. He is a native of Detroit and now splits his time between the Bay Area and the internet. So just to let you know, we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your dashboard with which you can purchase copies of the Logic series books. This will be happening throughout the course of the talk, so keep an eye on that function. Each participant is an author of a book, so check them out, please. There's going to be a Q&A towards the end of the talk, so please post your questions in the Q&A function. Everybody, welcome to our final session. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. Wow, what a great introduction from Peter Maravelis, the person with the best job in the whole city of San Francisco, in my opinion. So I'm super excited to be moderating this panel. I am a huge, embarrassing fan of every person and institution involved in this chat. If it was happening in person, this would almost certainly be happening in the poetry room at City Lights Bookstore, one of the all-time great convening spaces for intellectual life in like the whole world. The poetry room, by the way, has the great characteristic of no matter how many people show up for your book, it seems full, which is a big deal for a space where you have book events. So we're not there now, obviously. We're in this weird attenuated virtual version of that. But I want to conjure a bit of the spirit of the poetry room, because among many other of its characteristics, I think one of the things that's true about the poetry room at City Lights is that a large fraction of the people who have ever wandered in there in history and who have kind of wandered into its version of San Francisco, like the San Francisco that the poetry room represents, have wanted to be part of an intellectual scene. They wanted to be part of a network of thinkers who talk to each other, like made something. And we have before us an intellectual scene, a network of thinkers who have made something together that is sort of coherent and identifiable and started from nothing, and now it's these and a magazine and many other things. So we have a bunch of really, really smart people on this chat and a bunch of material to talk about, and that always runs the risk of being a little scattershot and incoherent. So I want to focus, at least to start, on a pretty specific question. It's almost like a murder mystery. How did this happen? How did we get this scene and these books? And so we have two of the several people. I know that there are other founders of Logic Magazine, Krista and Jim, who are not here, but the ones I have on the Zoom call are Moira and Ben. And so maybe Moira, I could ask you, like, ground floor, before we get to the existence of these books and these writers and their relationship, like, why does this exist? What is the kernel of this enterprise? Why'd you guys start this thing?
Thanks so much, Robin, for doing this, for moderating this conversation, for your kind words about Logic, and for teeing me up. Because I too think of the poetry room as a kind of sacred place for San Francisco in general, but for Logic in particular too. And there were a lot of reasons we started this project. Xiaowei was also there pretty much from the beginning. Tim was involved in the first issue. Adrian soon after. We can't quite remember which was the first City Lights Vesuvio party he showed up at. One of our goals was to deepen the discourse in the sense that Peter said, but another goal was to try to develop a kind of community. My line, which some people on this call have heard me say before, is that the only real reason to start a magazine is to throw parties. And it really was a goal from the outset to examine technology, but also to bring different folks together in space, in the space of the magazine, which Xiaowei so beautifully designed. And in the space of the poetry room, the space of the city of San Francisco. So I thought, if it's not too sentimental, I would click through just a couple photos from our very first event in the poetry room to conjure that place for all of us. Let me share the right screen. All right. Can everyone see my PowerPoint? Yes. No, let's see. Now, how do I full screen this? I'm revealing myself to be not as tech savvy as I should be. Well, anyway.
Go to slideshow.
Go to slideshow, but it's on the lower left, isn't it?
It's up at the menu.
Oh, right, my bad. All right, thank you, Ben. So I was delighted to realize, as I said, that many people on this call were there. I found this photo of Tim reading from his piece that he wrote for that first issue, The Madness of the Crowd, with Krista and Ben and many others looking on. I found Xiaowei speaking to everyone from the back of this room, which was actually quite full, Robin, in that instance. It wasn't just the magic of the room seeming full. All these people down the stairs craning to listen to Xiaowei. It was a really exciting moment. I got to read from our manifesto, which was co-authored. And yeah, we have this terrific.
Laura, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it seems frozen on the first slide. Are you
Oh,
going
really?
through the slideshow?
I am going through the slideshow. Is
In
it
that
not
case, maybe you should
working?
just return to the original window and you can just take us through in PowerPoint.
All right. I apologize for the technical difficulties. I'm the only Logic collaborator who's never worked in the tech industry, and maybe it's showing. All right, so you have Tim reading from this great article he did for the first issue, Xiaowei addressing the crowd, me getting to read from this manifesto, which was a group effort, and all these people who showed up to our sort of astonishment and who became, many of them, sort of friends and fellow travelers with the magazine. And a copy of the first issue crowded up at the front. And then I couldn't resist grabbing one screenshot from a later video just because Peter was in it. And Peter has been so supportive and hosted us so many times since the beginning. But yeah, I think I'm glad for this invocation to the poetry room, helping me fulfill my desire to throw parties around a magazine. And I would love to hear from the others about their memories of how the project came together.
Well, yeah, and I want to. There's so much to cover. But Ben, let me ask you, since you're someone who's obviously there at the very beginning. There was a line that actually Adrian used just earlier this week that just has stuck with me, and I think it will for a long time. Actually, just a phrase, and he called the tone of much of Logic's work and all these books neither sycophant nor scold. Right? It's neither. It's like not either of those things. But those are both negative definitions, and I'm wondering, like, positively, if you can think back to that moment of Logic's creation. Like, what did you all want it to be? What did you think was missing? What voice did you want to insert into the world of letters and the real life?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thanks so much, Robin, for being here and for doing this. And thank you to Peter and City Lights. Just want to echo what Moira said about how much we love City Lights, how important it's been to us as a magazine, trying to find our footing and find our world, but also to us as individuals. I mean, I spent too many hours, maybe years of my life at City Lights, and hope to do so soon again. I love that question, Robin, because I think we have often defined the origins of the magazine in negative terms. You know, neither sycophant nor scold, neither techno-utopian nor techno-dystopian. So the question is like, well, what are we for? And I think, you know, just piggybacking on Moira's point about wanting to throw parties. I mean, I think one positive goal for the magazine from the start was bringing people from different communities together, quite literally, into space, like to meet one another and have conversations, but also in the pages of the magazine. We felt at the time, and this kind of really gathered momentum with the kind of various social and political forces unleashed by the 2016 presidential election, but we were feeling strongly, certainly by the spring of 2017, that there was a lot of hunger on the part of tech workers, people within the industry, for more critical perspectives on technology of the kind that many scholars in academia were generating. And those were two communities, among others, that we wanted to connect. Also communities of activists and organizers, people who were active in mobilizations in the broader society. Tech workers were also getting interested in that, becoming more politicized, more radicalized. So I would say briefly, I think trying to build bridges between these different communities, bring them together, and hopefully build something that felt like more than the sum of its parts was an important early aspiration.
Was there a person, an ideal reader at that moment? Maybe that's overly simplistic, but if you imagine, you kind of like squinted your eyes and imagined a person picking up a copy of Logic from a stack in the poetry room browsing, who did you most want to get it into the hands of and to be taken seriously by?
Well, Peter Maravelis, of course. I mean, he was the ideal reader, and I hope you're listening, Peter. I mean, I think for us, you know, I think magazines create their readers. You know, I think a project like ours, you know, you create your own public, you create your community. And I think that's really strongly how we felt, where there were glimmers out there, there were latent capacities that we thought we could unlock. But ultimately, like, we wanted to create the Logic reader through Logic. And I honestly, I think we've done that. And I'm very proud of what we've done with the magazine, because I think there is like there aren't that many of them, but I think there's a type called the logic reader, and we made that person. It's a good feeling.
Okay, so Xiaowei, you were on the ground floor or near enough. What was it at that moment that attracted you to this concept and to made you into someone who wanted to participate in it? And if I may add a follow-up question, if I had teleported back in time to 2017 to that launch party and told you that you were going to have a book out in 2020 called Blockchain Chicken Farm, would that have been surprising, or like, oh yeah, naturally, seems reasonable?
So when I first joined Logic, I was still working in tech, and I had, exactly as Ben is describing, some of the projects that we were working on, the funding mechanisms, just seeing even the way that a lot of these bigger systemic issues are played out into the day-to-day of working in tech, it gave me a lot of pause. But at the same time, journalism was either saying, tech is so evil, there's nothing you can do about it, killer robots are coming. And I was just like, well, now what, right? So Logic really spoke to me as a tech worker, as this place of building up agency, really saying, hey, these futures, these inevitabilities are fictions, and you as a tech worker, you can have a role to play in this, to really change this. So I just felt so excited. And, with every single issue, I'm just like I have warm, fuzzy feelings of the community and the network that we're building. To your second question, I definitely would not have even dreamt that blockchain chicken is a thing. So it was all a very surprising journey.
Good. Well, that's good. I like that some of it felt very natural and some of it was a total curveball. Ben, you invoke kind of this sort of fusion or finding these bridges between academic discourse and some of the things happening there and like the real experience of tech workers in this world. Adrian, you are an academic, or you sort of have maybe your home base in the academic world. I wonder for you if that sense of a crossover, that opportunity of like sort of bridging the gap and speaking, not to other academics, but to like the people like Xiaowei who have these jobs are starting to wonder, is this, what am I hearing? Like, is this really right? Was that part of the appeal for you? And when you think about, what tech hall is thinking, do you see it sort of pointed at the Xiaoweis of today who are inside these organizations, kind of wondering, is this thinking?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I came to the Bay Area for pretty much the opposite reason from tech. I came here to teach 19th century literature. And then I found myself in this place. I was like, I got to make sense of it somehow. And above all, I had to make sense of it somehow because my students really were gravitating towards that. So, Xiaowei obviously is the generation removed from that, but it is. But I had students that badly wanted to be in tech, and sometimes that made me very happy. It's always nice to see someone who is excited about what they were passionate about, a particular project. And at other times, it freaked me out, where I thought like, wow, there's some questions not being asked here. And so I always felt that it was kind of, and that's partly probably, I came late to this enterprise. I'm kind of the Ringo of the bunch. But part of what always, the part of the reason why the sycophant scold thing never quite appealed to me was precisely because it's not the kind of relationship I want to have with my students, right? If a student says, I really want to go into tech, and I just yell at them, be like, you should be a professor. It's like, it's just, first of all, it's a shit thing to do. Second of, it's like, that's a toxic industry too, right? So I don't want to do that. At the same time, just being like, oh yeah, great, yeah, build that database, don't ask any questions. Like, it doesn't seem like, a critical theorist should be doing that either. So that always attracted me to it. That always made me very happy that there was something here that allowed me to be a kind of productive denizen of this particular slice of America, right? And sort of neither sort of dragoon people into caring about the things I care about, but sort of meeting them halfway in the things that they cared about.
So it's interesting. We're talking in some ways about changing people's minds or affecting their worldview and their behavior in the world. At the same time, we are talking about writing books, and there may or may not be some those things might or might not go together. Tim, I think of you as someone who takes very, very seriously the sort of efficacy of different media and different modes. Like, you just think very seriously about everything from algorithms to memes to AI to the way that people can kind of sort of game all sorts of different systems. And so if I had heard that, Tim Hwang's first big production was not a book, but a campaign of ads that actually made an argument across the whole global internet in this irresistible way, where suddenly everyone was aware of the subprime attention crisis, but they didn't really know why. That would seem very, very reasonable to me and very Tim-ish to me. But you didn't do that, or you didn't only do that. You produced this book. So when you think in this broader context of bridging these gaps, sort of creating this readership, creating this community, and as someone who is really smart about this stuff, Tim, how do you think about the role of book, the book as a format, as doing things in the world?
Sure, definitely. And I guess maybe it makes sense to answer that question by kind of stepping a point backwards, right? And thinking a little bit about sort of how do I sort of think about logic as a project? And in some ways, I kind of situate it in sort of the constantly shifting public mood around technology, right? And in the sense that, a lot of the rhetoric of the early 2000s was internet will solve everything, technology will solve everything, right? And I think we're now deep in the reverse, right? The public mood is, that everything with technology is terrible. And I do think that the pendulum will sort of swing back at some point, right? And I think there's a deep sort of intellectual project about is it possible to be optimistic about some of these systems without being a huge tool, right? And I do think that that's actually a hard thing to articulate in some ways, and something that needs to be articulated in long form, whether or not that exists as a magazine, right, as a collection of ideas. Or as a book, as something longer than, this pithy tweet that you put out about all this stuff. And so I do think that it's a nice format just in terms of thinking through almost the kind of intellectual assumptions that we bring to thinking about the technology as part of this effort, as part of this kind of love letter to the future, if you will, right? That at some point people will be oh, maybe this technology stuff isn't so bad, or maybe we should build this stuff better. And at that point, there will sort of be a need for this intellectual machinery to exist. And so in some ways, logic is kind of constructing that perhaps a little bit in advance of it actually occurring. And so I think the book is a great format to do that, just because it is a chance for kind of extended expression, because extended expression is what's needed. Yeah.
Who's your ideal reader, Tim? If you could press subprime attention crisis into one pair of hands and guarantee that they would read it and take it seriously, who would that person or that kind of person be?
Sure. So I was been joking with some people that the ideal outcome for the book is for it to annoy almost everybody. And in some ways, I think the ideal audience for the book is actually some of the most vociferous critics of the tech industry. Because the sort of game of subprime attention crisis is that we've assumed this thing about the internet, right? Which is that big online platforms have all this data, and that gives them the ability to effectively have a mind control, right? It has the ability to basically reach into your mind and deliver you, Robin, a message just at just the right time for you to purchase, whatever it is on Instagram, essentially. And I think there's a lot of critiques of the internet that are built around that, right? And in some ways, the idea is to kind of blow that whole assumption up and basically say the kind of claim of power that these companies have, that even the most sort of intense critics of technology has accepted, may not actually be backed up by the facts, right? And so there's actually a need to kind of ground our critique in something more than sort of the marketing speak of the companies themselves.
Sure.
And so the ideal reader, I think, is some ways the people who are most convinced that this is the worst thing ever.
Right. Of course. So it flips it around, and instead of this sort of apocalyptic scenario, it's actually. But that's interesting. So let me bounce that back to you, Moira, because I know that you've written a lot about the ways in which powerful tech platforms and algorithms connect to our most intimate parts of our lives, and finding other people that we like or think we like or whatever. What do you think about that? Do you think that it's is the right move at this moment in this sort of whatever, the pendulum, as Tim puts it, of sort of fear and, acceptance? Is it to kind of question that, omnipotence, or actually should we still kind of hang out there for a while because it's real and it's serious?
Well, thank you for asking me the question, because I'm so excited about Tim's book and I love this intervention it's making. I think it's very much in the spirit of the Logic Project. I mean, all of the books are in different ways, but as I see it, what I see Tim's book pushing back against is this way in which both the evangelists and the critics are speaking the language of hype, right? So, the evangelists are saying, look at our ad tech, it's so fantastic. Moira will buy exactly the diapers for her baby that you're trying to sell her at this moment or whatever. And then there's a critique, which is actually just the mirror image of that hype, that says, oh no, Moira, Instagram knows you need diapers. Mustn't it be sophisticated to know that you, who are constantly Googling stuff about babies, have a baby or whatever? Whereas, maybe that's actually a very basic advertising category to know about me. That if I'm posting a lot of pictures of a baby, maybe I have a baby. But I think what's so powerful about what Tim is doing and what really feels resonant with the Logic Project in general is that I see his book saying, neither, how to put it, we need a deeper discourse. We need a more accurate description of the reality that's not just premised on the hype, whether it's from the positive or critical point of view. And I think it's exactly an intervention that's needed right now. I think when we started in 2017, frankly, a lot of my friends on the East Coast anyway were just mystified about why we were doing this. And there was still this very strong techno-utopian narrative still. I mean, the Trump election started to change that. So sorry, I should clarify. We started talking about logic in 2016. I'd say by 2017, maybe things had changed a bit. But anyway, I think that this project of tech critique, which has now actually become kind of mainstream, didn't exist in the same way yet. And yet I still think there's so much more work to do in getting closer to the machine, to cite another one of Logic's patron saints. And I think all the books do that. My hope is that, I won't say it about my book, but the other books do it. And I hope that the book that Ben and I worked on does it in its own different way. So I think it's exactly the intervention that's needed to push critical thinking about technology forward at the moment.
That's interesting. It occurs to me that maybe the opposite of hype is like specificity and details and actual, the crunchy grit of real life. So there's a question in the chat that, wow, Andy Hamling, thank you for teeing up a perfect kind of intervention here. She asks, in the spirit of City Lights, Hallowed Ground, she's interested to hear reflections on place and the sort of the relationship of place to the culture of tech and these ideas. And that makes me think, of Xiaowei's book, which of all of the ones in this set sort of ventures the furthest afield. So I'm curious to know, as someone who did all the field work, to tell these very detailed, very crunchy, real, gritty stories, but also has deep experience in the Bay Area and the tech culture of the Bay Area. Xiaowei, what do you think about that? Is the myth of kind of tech's rooting here just that? Is it a myth? Is it real? How does this all connect? Tell us.
Well, so On said something really poignant last night, which is Silicon Valley is both a physical place, but also this kind of other place that's told through storytelling, through narrative, through this hype and marketing, right? And I think it is, especially on Moira's point about this kind of tech discourse that's critical becoming mainstream. I think that place is this really important thing that allows us to get specific and also get specific about the people that we're talking about, right? I think, oftentimes, and this is what tech does so well, you're designing for this mysterious user. You never see the user. Sometimes you meet them through a screen. Most of the time you're watching their clicks and stuff, or getting some data. But it's really, you're like, where do they live? What is their day-to-day material? What is like their socioeconomic, all these questions at play. But actually being in a place this is where all the tension comes up. This is where, you know, just on the ground, being in rural China, it's no longer like this indictment of Alibaba or singing the praises of Alibaba. You really have to take, I mean, I felt like I had to kind of take an ethical stance just by the virtue of traveling all the way to China, talking to these people, taking up their time. Many of them were just like, you're an idiot. Why are you here asking me all these questions? That, you know, wanting to be empathetic and not extractive and not just say like, oh, here's some rural farmer who's using Alibaba now. They're, you know, so ignorant of how bad tech is, right? It could have been really easy to just make that generalization. And so, yeah, place feels important to me to ground that specificity.
Well, okay, so you've taken it not just to place, but to people, to real people, and maybe not the sort of characters that have been associated by press, good and bad, with tech. And then that makes me think of the book that you and Moira put together, this sort of Voices from the Valley, which includes, you know, some of those characters, the founder, the technical writer, but it also includes the chef and the massage therapist. You know, these are people who live in the Bay Area who go to some of these same sort of spaceship campuses, and they have sort of stories of their own and opinions of their own. I have so many questions, but I guess the first one is, in that first sort of convening at Logic, did you have a sense that the cook and the massage therapist were part of this conversation, or is that something that you found your way to over time?
Well, I think that from the start, we had a fairly expansive view of who the tech worker was. I think that was really important to us from the beginning, to make this point that a tech worker is anyone who performs work for a tech company, whatever the kind of work, whatever the employment status, whatever kind of wherever they sit in this very complex class occupational hierarchy, they're a tech worker. And I think that's not to submerge the differences, the divisions that are very present and often very, very intense between, say, a software engineer at Google and, you know, a janitor at Google. But I think it also, that putting those folks into the same category also can be very illuminating. I think it can kind of illuminate these points of contact, these shared experiences. And I hope this is something that you see in the book, where people are experiencing a lot of the same phenomena. They're kind of like going through the same industry. They're observing it from different vantage points. And in some cases, those are very different vantage points, but nonetheless, there are echoes. There are these points of contact that they share. And that, to me, it was something I had hoped to find, but I was very gratified that we did find, and I hope that comes across in the book.
Who's your ideal reader for Voices from the Valley? If you could, same question as before, if you could put that into someone's hands and make them read them and make them really digest it, who would that be?
I would give two answers to this question. I think the first, maybe and most obvious one, is someone who doesn't know anything about the tech industry, whose knowledge of the tech industry is primarily derived from the kind of hype that we've been talking about, either the kind of boosterish hype or the kind of doomerish hype, right? And I hope that they could pick up this book and just get a little bit of a reality check of like, oh, here are actually all these individuals who make up the industry that don't quite fit into those categories. I think the other reader I would hope for is frankly, and this is a smaller set, but people who work in the industry, who maybe haven't quite yet found those points of contact with those other kinds of individuals within the industry, and are looking for them, are looking for a way to kind of build these relationships of mutual recognition, which can really enrich their understanding of what the industry actually is.
So that's interesting. It sort of suggests a much more porous boundary for the logic reader and the logic person. And Adrian, I wonder, so in your book, What Tech Calls Thinking, you sort of take on some of the really core and very recognizable kind of pieties of I don't even know, Hacker News or TechCrunch. I don't know what to call the sort of supernova center of it. But in your reading and kind of experience of the world, do you think that What Tech Calls Thinking is sort of everywhere now? Like, where is the, like, if it's a radioactive dye and there's a drop of it in Palo Alto, like how far has it spread in the world into different places, different organizations, different ways of living and working?
So that's a great question. And I would give a double answer to that. On the one hand, one of the things that made me want to write the book was the sense that this kind of thinking was starting to be very widely disseminated. And the other thing was that it wasn't actually coming directly from tech necessarily. That is to say that it was a kind of a collaboration between people in the companies themselves, often just the founder, often certainly not the rank and file, and then the media that sort of desperately needed to cover these people and find something kind of cool to say about them, or about politicians that wanted to project some kind of meaning onto the truly extraordinary success of some of these companies. And I sort of started writing about Silicon Valley for mostly German newspapers. And one of the things that really sort of freaked me out in the beginning is that you can, when you write these stories, you can sort of tell what stories you're being asked, what stories you can tell that will be well received and which ones are just going to leave people kind of stupefied and they're like, this doesn't fit into anything. And they always wanted to hear that there was a particular kind of ideology that was very identifiable that they all had, right? But often enough, it was something that was projected onto these companies, I had felt. And so I think that there is something, so it's a dual thing. On the one hand, what tech calls thinking has become more widely disseminated, but I think to some extent the people disseminating it are not actually are not the tech companies themselves. Right. There's something awfully convenient about these companies, and they play a role for people who have nothing to do with them, right? For every Peter Thiel, there's a person out there who whose hustle it is to sort of sell disruption and in their own particular backyard, and this idea of youth and energy kind of like almost parasitically kind of enriches what they're doing, right?
Right. Okay, so that makes me wonder just how ideas spread in general, like what channels they use to the world, and that makes me think of Tim again. Because Tim, I should sort of confess that of all the people in this very august group, Tim is probably the one that I know the best. And I have, for a while now, thought of myself as a sort of outlying member of the greater Tim Hwang co-prosperity sphere, an intellectual network in its own right. I never imagined that Tim would be a member of other intellectual networks, but here he is. These overlapping circles. So Tim, again, you're someone who thinks about how things move through the world in channels, both public and private, sort of like cryptic or sort of beneath the surface. And I'm curious to know what you think, based on your own, your observation of the world and your own personal experience, sort of exchanging ideas with other people and building, sort of bases for these things. This is very public, right? Logic is a public magazine. It's a public video chat. These books are all public. There's other ways that these things spread that are more kind of submerged in Slacks and Discords and IMs and everything else. When you think about just kind of like, I don't know, this sounds like what tech calls thinking, but when you think about the sort of operationalization ideas, how do you think about the channels?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I was going to joke, actually, it's kind of like we've gone from what tech calls thinking to what thinkers call tech in some ways, right? Yeah, which is like, what is the construction of this thing called technology and how does it spread ultimately? And yeah, I do think that one of the interesting dynamics that I think a lot about is how the sort of kind of very stochastic outcomes in the tech industry influence our sort of common sense knowledge of what technology is and how it works. Right. So you end up getting a lot of cargo culting, right? Because you're not sure what company is going to be successful. And when it is in a massive, like, globe-changing way, everybody associates that success with certain types of things, right? But it's actually unclear if any of those attributes have anything to do with the success of a company or the industry or a way of thinking, right? And I do think that thinking about, why and how, say, technology thinking has spread to DC, right? I'm doing some work with a DC think tank now, right? And there's a lot of like, well, we should be nimble. We should launch and iterate policy like we do, in the tech industry. And I do think that that is kind of an interesting effect of the sort of like cargo cult type nature of technology, right? In that no one's really sure what will be successful. When it is, it's explosively successful. And as a result, we sort of cling to a number of things randomly, right? And I do think that's actually an incredibly powerful way for these ideas to spread, because ultimately what you get is this sort of urban legend around the sort of success of technological thinking or technological practice, right? And so you end up saying like, well, maybe we should launch and iterate kind of everything, right? And this has in some ways been lampooned, right? Where people are like, well, you shouldn't move fast and break things with infrastructure, right? Which I think is a right thing to say. But I think it is interesting how much like that sort of explosive success has been its own calling card, right? And has been such a way of kind of injecting a certain way of thinking into all sorts of strata within society. And so I think you almost don't need to rely on some intellectual dark web, right? That I think that the marketing has been this sort of like desire to be associated with this success that has occurred.
You're suggesting a sort of stochastic intellectual scene, which I find terrifying. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I'm being too simplistic, but it's very scary to me. It makes me think of a question that was asked a few minutes ago by Christina Kelly in the chat, who observes correctly that many of the people in this chat sort of approach this intersection of technology and the humanities with great sensitivity and great awareness, and observes that maybe this is not the case broadly across the board. And I connect that to that question of sort of like understanding what really happened. I feel like that's one of the things that the humanities kind of helps us do, maybe in a way that pure tech doesn't. So Moira, I mean, this is a big question, and so I apologize in advance, but Moira, do you think that the humanities and the deep vein of humanities that is in all of logic actually helps us with this, helps us with maybe untangling Tim's challenge of like, what even does matter? Do you think it's a good tool in the arsenal?
I certainly think it's a good tool in the arsenal. I mean, I think while Tim was saying, making this nice play on Adrian's title of, not just what tech calls thinking, but what a thinker's called tech. And then thinking about Christina's question, and this question specifically of whether technology can learn to love or feel emotion or become human, I almost want to flip the question and say, what do we think technology is separate from the human, right? That there's sort of, I think there's a tendency, and it's a real symptom of both the hype discourses and the doomer discourses we've been talking about, to talk about technology as if it has its own agency, as if it's, with my humanities academic hat on, I might say a kind of object fetishism of technology. And I think that at the end of the day, I see, and I think many of us at Logic see technology as being about human relations, and all sorts of human institutions shape how these tools are made and how they work. And I think one doesn't need to get into literary theory or this kind of humanities, although one might, thinking about disinformation and conspiracy and all these problems, one might. But I think that we don't even need to reach too far afield to see the usefulness of using a more humanistic, also sociological, cultural perspective on how those relations make technology.
Right. It is that my mind goes back again to specificity and like the actual texture of reality, which you can kind of set against the, this is my own contribution here, but it has seemed to me that a lot of the discourse treats tech as almost a, like a pantheon of gods, right? Like even like financially, just the, Apple and Amazon and Google and Netflix and, two others, these are our figures, and they're like throwing lightning bolts at each other, and these are the stories we're going to tell. One of the questions I think is actually very on point, and I thank Claire Ma in the questions for bringing this up, is that like there are many other tech companies and tech, even, I mean, just truly in the economic reality of the Bay Area, for as big as Google and Facebook and NVIDIA are, there's a lot more. So Xiaowei, I know from reading your acknowledgements that you have worked at a couple of sort of smaller and, at least from my point of view, more interesting and kind of like better tech companies, and you kind of take pains to say that you like loved the people you worked with there, and you really like learned a lot and loved those places. When you consider that experience, that sort of zoomed in experience at these sort of smaller, more thoughtful places against this bigger, the pantheon tech, do you think it's true that people miss something there, and the definition of a tech company is a little impoverished in like the broader public discourse?
I mean, I think that in general, we do suffer from an impoverishment of the imagination. And, you know, I think regardless of scale, that, you know, I was just talking with someone the other day about especially teaching and, you know, educating undergrads who are about to go into tech. And we actually ended up talking about British colonialism. Fun topic, right? But so one of the things is that, you know, so many people were part of building the British Empire, and, you know, a big tool was tech, was, you know, all these innovations, things like that. And when you're in it, you don't have a sense of the boundaries of, you know, what you're in when you're at that juncture, right? And so really working at a company, you know, there are still fiscal mechanisms, VCs, like a, you know, the board that comes in and has all these demands, you know, certain unnamed heads of companies, you know, not even like announcing that they're about to have a child just so that they can get that VC money. And so I think that it's actually more just like a general thing that we need to examine about the day-to-day, about how those ideologies and narratives are crafted. I think your question too reminds me a lot of something that I ask myself, right? Especially when we try to critique tech, is, are we operating at the level of institutional critique where we're using the same vocabulary of the institution, like policy, regulation, to talk about tech? Or are we talking about, you know, a general like kind of worker power, you know, that really is grassroots and going to move from the ground up and from consciousness and like ethics? And I think those two work together. And for me, I'm interested in that grassroots, right? It's like the revolution versus abolition question. We always frame it.
Ben, that makes me think of some of your other writing, some of your writing in Logic and other places about sort of just like a different future for tech and the relationship between tech and work. Is that, I feel like we've been sort of like circling around this in a way to identify like who is the logic reader and like what is the logic consciousness? Is it tech and work, or is it tech and work and something else, or 10 other things?
Yeah, these are great and big and difficult questions.
I know.
I think I like the way Xiaowei put it. I think, you know, you can think of it as a theory of change, right? And there are different theories of change out there. I think, you know, I don't want to speak for everyone. Logic has a lot of team members and a lot of contributors, but I would like to think that Logic's theory of change is very much a bottom-up theory of change. It's the kind of theory of change that I think Xiaowei was placing emphasis on, which is it comes from the bottom, it comes from the grassroots, it comes from workers, it comes from communities, and there's a kind of democratic spirit that animates that movement. And I think that's a really important vision to hold on to right now while we're in this kind of techlash moment. You know, Tim mentioned the pendulum is kind of swinging. A lot of old narratives and mythologies are being destabilized. New regulatory possibilities are arriving on the horizon. And everything in our society, because of the way it's constructed, points very heavily to change coming from the top, change taking a kind of technocratic cast where a fairly small handful of credentialed people put together the plan and it kind of trickles down to everybody else. And that's, you know, often what happens in one sector or one sphere of our life after another. And I think the hope, you know, with Logic is that we can contribute in a very small way, but hopefully a meaningful way towards a different way to reorganize our technologies, one that starts from this bottom up perspective and which hopefully brings, you know, I think the holy grail of this would be a society in which people who are affected by a particular technology have an opportunity to participate in the design and implementation of that technology, where there are alliances between the workers who build technologies and the communities who use the technologies. That's my North Star.
That's awesome. In some ways, I think that answers the question of like, well, yeah, what is maybe at the core, and we've already established that it's, you know, diffuse and extends out in all these different ways, but maybe that's kind of what is at the heart this enterprise. As we kind of wind towards the close here, I do have a couple more questions that I want to swing around and hit everyone with. One of them, Dan Bauk in the chat wants to go back to the question of these books. I mean, because I keep holding them up, and that's actually, it's a little bit dorky, but it's also something real. And it's, not for nothing that of the faces I see on this screen, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 have books in the background. And part of that is the kind of people we are, but part of that is something else. And so I'm just curious, I just want to go around and quickly, and maybe we can kind of bring this down to a slightly more personal level, not quite so abstract and, what will we do in the world? But for all of you as writers, including some people for whom this is your first book, that's going to be on the shelves at City Lights. What does that mean to you when this became a possibility, working with FSG Originals and Logic Magazine? Like, how did that feel? Adrian, I guess I'll start with you. You're no stranger to sort of publication and making arguments in the public sphere, but how did this feel different, and how does this physical object feel to you?
I was unprepared for how good it felt, I think, which is ironic given that I in the book make fun of people who fetishize books, which is like making fun of myself because that's totally what I do. But yeah, when the PDF arrived, I was pretty stoked, and then when the box of physical copies arrived, that was a sobbing mess. So clearly I'm very bad at taking my own advice. I have intellectually I had one position, but then it was like Daisy in the Great Gatsby with the shirts. I was just bawling over these physical books. So I can give you two answers, right? Like intellectually, I think it's not a big deal. Emotionally, I was a wreck.
That's the answer I want. That's the answer I was looking for. Tim, what about you?
Sure. I think it was a good forcing function in a lot of ways. The sort of thing I guess I'll reveal about the book, right, is that actually a lot of the arguments that are made in the book were parts of a really terrible PDF I uploaded with the Friends of the Internet, back in 2013. And it is sort of interesting that sort of like the impact of doing that is very, very limited, right? And so I do like the notion of like, you can take the same ideas and package them up into this physical thing. And suddenly you have an excuse to talk about it. And it's like a statement has been made in the public square. And so almost like I feel like the theater of the book as a prop is like incredibly powerful here in terms of trying to take an idea and like, push it into a discussion that you want it to be in. So yeah, I don't know. That's kind of how I think about it.
I think that's wise. Xiaowei, what about you?
So it's, as someone who used to push code, it would also always be like, oh, I can like change this later. Obviously you can't do that with a book. So once I had that realization, it was more for me, I was just so elated to receive the book in my hands and be like, this is a way to provoke and move conversation and really be in community with a lot of people who, I don't know who the reader will be. And that's just really exciting to me.
Ben and Moira, you worked on this book together, and rather than have you sort of treat you as a indivisible unit, I'll split this question up. Ben, you've written other books, and you, of course, are in part responsible for all of these. I was excited to get this bundled, all released at the same time, which, if folks don't know, is weird in a wonderful way. I mean, this is one of FSG Originals' great kind of innovations. They publish things in weird cadences, and sometimes they publish them all at once. How did this whole project feel to you, Ben?
Well, I'll answer Robin briefly in a kind of more personal mode, because that's what you were, I think, asking for. I mentioned that I spent a ton of time at City Lights growing up. As a kid, I grew up in San Francisco and in other wonderful San Francisco bookstores like Green Apple. And, it maybe sounds silly or sentimental, but I mean, to me, the exciting thing about publishing like a print book that exists in the world is the possibility that someone will serendipitously come across it in a bookstore. Because that's what I did with hours, months, years of my childhood, was just kind of go through shelves and just pick up whatever was there. Annie Hamming had a great question that we spoke to briefly a little bit earlier about any reflections we had on the role that tech has played in changing San Francisco and the effect it's had on the mystique of the city. And for me, kind of like the soul of the city that I was really drawn to as a kid in San Francisco was the spirit of the bookstores, was the spirit of the kind of counterculture that lived on through these institutions like City Lights. And I hope that with the Logic and with this book series, we found a way to bring that spirit and apply it back to tech, this force that in many ways is responsible for killing a lot of that spirit from the city, very sadly. But hopefully we can build a new higher synthesis in a Hegelian sense.
Actually, I don't know, you probably couldn't see it, but my face was trembling a little bit. That is a beautiful sentiment. Okay, so we have nearly concluded our virtual gathering in the not the poetry room here. But this is only, the first wave, and surely in another 18 months, 2 years, after this pandemic has been sort of, defeated and managed, we will gather again in the real poetry room in City Lights. And no matter how many people there are, it will feel full and vibrant. And we'll have a new set of books. And so my challenge to you is, let's say that we in this group have to write them. And so you have to write it based on your obsession of the moment, whatever it is. You're going to start today. You're going to submit your proposal and start the manuscript. So Moira, I hate to make you go first, but what is your contribution going to be to the Logic FSG Originals series of fall 2022?
So you didn't let me say my cosmic thing about how I feel about physical books. Now I'm on the spot for a new idea.
It's horrible. I apologize.
I think so, partly inspired, but this is not what I'm supposed to be working on now. And I hope no one except Dan Bauk, who I work with, is watching this. But partly inspired by Xiaowei's work, I've gotten pretty obsessed with e-commerce and how supply chains and like how Amazon specifically structures sort of race, gender, and identity. So I would love to write something kind of weird about Amazon sellers and their world in the time of COVID, but that certainly probably won't happen. And I think we should have books by other people next time.
No, I know. Yeah, understood. This is a purely theoretical exercise, and you're all, to be clear, you're all totally indulging me. Adrian, what is your, we've created the slot for you in the 2022 season. So what is your current obsession that you'll turn into a slim and powerful argument?
So I've been really fascinated by the way gender and sexuality have sort of intersected with the early tech industry. So if I had to, it's going to go somewhere else. I'm going to go very, very offline. But if I were to pitch another Logic book, it would be about this, about how these companies, which would always be kind of a boosterish kind of story about how these companies just were a little bit more open to gay men and to single women, and how that was sort of a way in which new social networks sort of were able to be structured in San Francisco in the 70s and 80s. So that would be mine.
I'm sorry to tell you, but I have to read that book now, so this is mandatory. Xiaowei, what about you? 2022, what can we look forward to?
I think it would be something about like thinking oceanically and also like looking at actually, I've found really inspiring a lot of communities who are actually doing the like kind of grassroots building of tech for their communities, and just, yeah, more about them and what they're making.
I feel like we're going to start selling pre-orders on these books in like another 90 seconds. Tim, finally, to close things out, what can we look forward to in the?
I mean, it's not very technologically related or logic-y. I don't know if that's a problem, Robin.
No, not at all.
So there's a turn of the century, and by that I mean the 19th century vaudeville act where a person would talk to a talking skull. And it was actually this clockwork machinery that was built for the purposes of performing this act. And there's actually a whole culture of people who like collect and try to find these vaudeville mechanical talking skulls. And there's a super interesting history there about sort of the relationship between kind of technology and the performing arts.
In addition to being a brilliant idea, that sounds like an idea for a book generated by an AI trained on a corpus of Tim Hwang obsessions. So perfect and perfect. Okay, great. So it's a date. We'll all meet again, not just us in this video chat, but everybody who's tuned in. Thank you all for watching this. Thanks for the great questions in the chat. Thank you, Logic Magazine. Thank you, FSG Originals, the phantasmal presence of Emily Bell and Jackson Howard out there somewhere. And of course, thank you to Gray Area and City Lights for, convening us in this space. It's been a real pleasure.